As Indiscreet Mirage is the latest Assassin's Creed game, and unfortunately not even close to being the greatest Assassin's Creed game. As a matter of fact, it's not even close to being somewhat decent, it's just kind of shit. Assassin's Creed Mirage was the perfect Assassin's Creed game to come out. It was going to go back to the roots of the franchise, which in my opinion is a good thing. I've grown tired of the Witcher 3 wannabe Assassin's Creed games that aren't really Assassin's Creed games. So yeah, I was looking forward to this one. Until I got my hands on it and actually played it and realized that that whole bullshit of it going back to the roots of the franchise was, well, bullshit. The best way I would describe this game is lazy. Everything about this game is lazy. Now a quick rundown on what I think about certain elements of this game. Story is pretty boring and bland, and nothing eventful happens in the story at all. As a matter of fact, it gets kind of repetitive after a while. The missions are very basic. The characters are all one-dimensional, except for Basim, who's 1.1 dimensional, purely due to the fact that he is suffering from Vietnam flashbacks. And that's really the only thing that makes him unique. And those Vietnam flashbacks that he keeps on getting, well, the payoff of that is terrible. It kind of gets revealed as a twist at the end of the game. What the fuck was that? Then there is the old open world, and I'll give some credit where credit is due. The open world is beautiful, as always. This is a Ubisoft game, so of course the world is beautiful. And I actually like the wanted system in this game. I think it's pretty decent, but everything else is, it's Ubisoft. It's filled with the same boring, repetitive points of interest, or whatever the hell you want to call them. If you've done one, you've done them all. And yes, it's not as bloated as Odyssey or Valhalla, but it's still boring. I mean, there is nothing interesting to do in this open world. It's boring. And a special shout out to whoever handled the parkour, because Basim doesn't want to do anything that I want him to do. Like seriously, how the hell did you mess this up? And finally, the side quests are as bland and generic as you can imagine. But of course, I assume you can read and you've read the title, and you know what the meat of this video is about: the combat. Now, to go over the combat, I'm going to separate it into two parts. The first part being the actual stabby combat, and the second part being the stealth combat. Now, to understand why the combat in Assassin's Creed Mirage is terrible, it is important to look back at the older games and see where it is different. The old games had a simple yet effective combat system. It was very fun and it made the player feel like a bloody badass. Now, the old combat system relied on counter-attacks. It didn't expect the player to go in running and slashing everything to bits. It was a combat system that was kind of more defensive. It also had proper AI, proper enemy AI, which understood how to keep pressure on the player. The player would constantly be surrounded by enemies that would attack from different sides, which is where the counter-attack system really came into play. Also, if there were more than 3 enemies at a time, the game would limit the amount of enemies surrounding the player to 3, and as soon as one was taken out, another would fill its place. And it worked perfectly. Now, Assassin's Creed Mirage does tempt this. And I use the word attempt because some people might actually be fooled in thinking that, well, Assassin's Creed Mirage also has a counter system. That doesn't make it feel anything like the older combat systems. The first thing that I noticed about Assassin's Creed Mirage was how the enemies were stupid. They just don't know what the hell is going on. That whole thing about the player being surrounded in the older games, that doesn't happen in Assassin's Creed Mirage at all. They just kind of stand around and look confused. The thing about the old Assassin's Creed games is as soon as you took one of them out, another would almost immediately attack you. There was kind of a rhythm and a pattern to it which doesn't exist in Assassin's Creed Mirage, and it really makes the game feel clunky. Now Assassin's Creed Mirage also has a stamina bar and a dodge, and this dodge in this game is super overpowered. I mean, you don't even really need to rely on the parries to make the combat work. You can just dodge your way out of any situation, which is a problem. I know Assassin's Creed Brotherhood had a dodge as well, but it wasn't nearly as effective as this one. In addition to that, enemies now have unparryable attacks in a system that is supposed to rely on parries. The unparryable attacks is just an annoyance and adds to the combat not flowing at all. I don't know why they decided to do this. The older games had a system where enemies would block your attacks. You can attack them and they would just block it, and the way to basically take them out is by breaking their defense. It was yet again a simple and effective way of creating a little bit more challenge in the combat, which Assassin's Creed Mirage just seemingly forgot about, and instead replaced it with this non-parryable attacks. This is made even worse by the fact that there is literally an enemy in this game that only does non-parryable attacks, and the way to defeat him is to go around him and hit him from behind. Now, in addition to that, there is the problem of the enemies being damage sponges and not staggering after they've been hit. And this is a big problem because it makes the combat feel floaty and non-responsive. It's not fun, especially when enemies are blankly staring you directly in the eyes after you've hit them like twice. Now I know that after 3 hits they do stagger, but I mean, it's terrible. I don't know why and how Ubisoft keep making combat systems that just feel so floaty and non-responsive. Now, another noticeable thing about this game is the lack of finishing moves, which is surprising to me given that a game that came out 10 years ago had more finishing moves in this game. Not just more, but so many of them that you could basically fill up a 10-minute video montage on YouTube about them. And yet, Assassin's Creed Mirage barely has any, which is just a perfect example of why I think this game is so very lazy. The thing is that Assassin's Creed Mirage combat feels like they took Assassin's Creed Valhalla's combat and tried to patch it to feel more like the old school combat. And that's probably true given that this game was apparently supposed to be a DLC expansion for Assassin's Creed Valhalla, so there's probably truth in that. The problem with it is that you can tell, I mean, it just feels janky and clunky. You don't get that sense of feeling that you did in the older games where the combat just flowed and had a rhythm to it and actually felt satisfying and made the player feel like a badass. Now let's get into the stealth element of the combat. The stealth in this game is probably where I'm most disappointed in. And yes, it is better than the stabby combat, but it's still disappointing. Now, the first thing that I notice is the lack of tools in this game. This game has about the same amount of tools that Assassin's Creed Origin has. And yet, this is meant to be a more stealth-focused game. So why don't we get more creative and unique tools in this game to really experiment with and fully take advantage of the sandbox aspect of Assassin's Creed Mirage? In addition to this, there is a lack of enemy variety. and it's a serious issue. Now, the best game to compare this game to is Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor. A game that gives you a lot of abilities and a lot of skills, but also gives you a wide variety of enemies. But more importantly, the enemies in that game have counters to your skills and abilities, which means that even though the game gives you a lot to experiment with, you're going to have to use everything to assassinate enemies in that game, because they counter certain abilities. And for me, that's the kind of system I was looking for in Assassin's Creed Mirage, a system that we didn't get. The only enemy in this game that basically counters some of your tools is the big brute enemy that wears head armor or whatever. They're very distinguishable, and basically you can't kill them with throwing knives or shoot them with poison/sleeping darts. And yet again, that's the only enemies that really counter any tools. And given that there is only 6 enemy types in this game, I would at least expect that all of them counter a tool that you have at your disposal. But that doesn't happen. And the problem with that is that the stealth in this game is brain dead. And I mean, it is absolutely brain dead. It doesn't offer any challenge at all. And it is why I've heard so many people complain about this game's combat overall just being boring. Because I didn't mention this with the stabby combat, but this game is very easy. I mean, even on hard difficulty, it is a walk in the park. And this is especially true with the stealth. Now, I've mentioned that the game doesn't really give you much tools, but the tools it does give you is very overpowered, purely due to the fact that there are no enemy counters. There aren't any enemies that are immune to any of the tools you have, which makes it feel so overpowered. But in addition to that, the game gave you a superhero ability, which is, well, way too overpowered. And this is where I'm very annoyed at this game, because this is just terrible. It basically allows you to tag up to 5 enemies and they'll be taken out. There is no challenge to it. It is as brain dead as you get. Now, of course, I can't go without saying that the stealth in this game feels extremely clunky. The stabby combat bits felt clunky, but the stealth is really where the clunk of this game shines. Much like how the stabby combat doesn't flow in this game, the stealth doesn't flow either. The old games were, well, how do I put this? The old school Assassin's Creed games had so much more flow to the stealth. The thing is that you can clearly see that multiple enemies being close to each other were taken into consideration, and they all have unique animations for these assassinations in the situations. Unlike Assassin's Creed Mirage, which doesn't have any of that. There aren't specific animations for specific assassinations. And this just overall is why it feels so clunky. I can't emphasize enough how clunky this feels, which is why I'm constantly repeating myself over and over by saying it's clunky, because it very well is. Playing an old Assassin's Creed game after Assassin's Creed Mirage just highlights how clunky everything is. And this is why I think that the stealth and the combat overall just didn't work as well as it did in the older games. So yeah, that's what I have to say about Assassin's Creed Mirage. If you've made it this far in the video, I thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.